congressional chamber hummed with an undercurrent of unease. A low murmur of voices, the rustle of papers, and the constant flicker of cameras filled the air. At the center of it all sat Alan Dershowitz, the veteran Harvard law professor whose name had long been synonymous with constitutional interpretation. His sharp eyes surveyed the committee room, chin lifted in quiet confidence. To his right, a glass of water sat untouched. Across the long mahogany table sat Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett of Texas. A former civil rights attorney with a reputation for precision and steel, she leaned forward slightly, one hand resting on a neatly organized manila folder. Her expression was unreadable, but her stillness carried weight. Every few seconds, her fingers tapped softly against the folder's edge, a rhythm of patience and calculation. Chairman James Davidson, presiding with an air of procedural authority, rapped his gavel once. "The Committee on Oversight and Accountability will come to order," he announced. Cameras whirred as the focus shifted to the witness table. Today's hearing concerns constitutional interpretations of executive privilege. We are privileged to have Professor Alan Dershowitz, author of 37 books on law and constitutional theory, with us to offer expert testimony. Polite applause followed. Dershowitz nodded curtly. "Thank you, Mr. Chairman," he began. His tone was measured, professorial, almost rehearsed. The Constitution's structure depends upon a careful balance between the branches of government. Executive privilege is an essential element of that balance, one that preserves the independence of the presidency. He paused just long enough for cameras to capture his poise. "I have always maintained that principle, regardless of which party held the Oval Office." Crockett's gaze didn't waver. Beneath the table, her thumb brushed the edge of the folder. The hearing room was packed. Reporters, law students, and political aides filled every seat. Even the press gallery overflowed with correspondence from major networks. To most, it seemed a routine display of congressional formality. But for Crockett, this wasn't routine. She had spent weeks preparing for this moment, poring through decades of Dershowitz's writings, media appearances, and legal arguments. She'd noticed something no one else seemed to, an unmistakable pattern that changed depending on who held power. As Republican members began their questioning, the tone was almost deferential. Congressman Mark Hollier offered a leading query that let Dershowitz restate his expertise. "Professor," Hollier said, "could you elaborate on why executive privilege remains valid even for former presidents?" "Certainly," Dershowitz replied smoothly. "Executive privilege is not about protecting a person, but an office. Its continuity ensures that presidential advisors can offer candid counsel without fearing future exposure. The Supreme Court has long affirmed this reasoning." A few nods followed from the Republican side. Cameras caught his confident half-smile. He was in familiar territory, an academic defending a well-honed thesis. But across the aisle, Crockett remained silent, watching. She jotted brief notes but never looked down for long. Her staff knew that every document in that folder had been tabbed with surgical precision. When the Democrats' turn arrived, Congresswoman Eliza Torres took the microphone. "Professor," she began, "would you agree that executive privilege cannot extend to cover criminal activity?" Dershowitz shifted slightly. "Of course there are limits," he said, "but one must balance those limits with the broader constitutional framework. Each case requires contextual interpretation." The exchange continued in polite but tense tones, Democrats probing for inconsistency, Dershowitz countering with nuance. Each answer was technically sound, layered with constitutional jargon. Yet something about the cadence, how he cited context again and again, seemed almost rehearsed. Crockett leaned back, folding her arms. She'd heard this argument before, on television, in op-eds, in his books, and she knew exactly where it didn't hold. After nearly 90 minutes, Chairman Davidson adjusted his glasses. "The committee recognizes the gentlewoman from Texas, Congresswoman Crockett." A subtle ripple passed through the room. Reporters raised their phones. Crockett straightened, adjusted her microphone, and spoke with quiet authority. "Thank you, Mr. Chairman." She turned to Dershowitz. "Professor, you've repeated two key points today: that your position on executive privilege has been consistent throughout your career, and that your analysis is entirely nonpartisan. Is that accurate?" Yes, Dershowitz replied with confidence. My views are grounded in constitutional principle, not politics. Crockett's expression softened, almost sympathetic. That's what I thought you'd say. She opened her folder, the sound crisp in the silent chamber. Because I've reviewed your record carefully, and what I found doesn't align with that claim. From the folder, she pulled out a neatly printed page. In 1997, you wrote in the New York Times that executive privilege should be, quote, narrowly construed when the public's right to know outweighs confidentiality within the executive branch. Do you stand by that principle? Dershowitz's brow furrowed. I do, but then, Crockett interrupted smoothly, how do you reconcile that with your 2019 CNN appearance, where you stated, quote, executive privilege covers almost all communications between the president and advisors? Those positions are not merely nuanced, they're opposites. The murmur in the gallery grew louder. The professor adjusted his tie. The factual contexts differ, Congresswoman. Legal principles adapt to circumstance. Context, Crockett repeated softly, flipping another tab. Let's test that. In 1998, during the Clinton investigation, you said, executive privilege cannot be used to hide illegal or improper actions. Yet in 2020, regarding the Trump administration, you argued, executive privilege protects the office even when allegations of impropriety exist. That's not context, Professor. That's contradiction. Dershowitz inhaled sharply, eyes narrowing. The nature of the inquiries was distinct. The only distinction, Crockett countered, her tone calm but cutting, was which party occupied the White House. A wave of murmurs rolled across the room. The chairman's gavel struck twice for order. Cameras zoomed in. You could almost see the pulse in Dershowitz's temple. Congresswoman, selective citation of my statements is misleading, he protested. I'm not cherry-picking, Crockett replied, reaching for another sheet. I've compiled 27 examples of your contradictory interpretations of executive privilege, organized by which party controlled the presidency. She held up a large chart, 2 columns side by side. On one, quotes from Democratic administrations. On the other, from Republican ones. The disparity was staggering. The room froze. Even the camera operators seemed to hold their breath. Dershowitz blinked, visibly unsettled. This is a gross mischaracterization of my scholarship, he said, voice tight. Then clarify, Crockett replied evenly. Which version should the American people believe? The one that applies when a Democrat is in office or the one you advance when a Republican is? Your insinuation is inappropriate, he shot back. You're turning constitutional law into political theater. I'm quoting you, Crockett answered, her tone unflinching. If your own words create theater, perhaps the script deserves scrutiny. Gasps rippled through the audience. Chairman Davidson leaned forward. Congresswoman, your time is nearly expired. One final question, Mr. Chairman, she said, lifting a final document. Professor Dershowitz, did you send this email to the White House counsel's office in January 2021, offering to develop legal justification for expanded executive privilege to block congressional oversight? The professor froze. His composure fractured like glass. Where did you? That's a private communication. This document, Crockett said steadily, was provided to our committee by a former White House staff member. It directly contradicts your sworn testimony that your positions are based on constitutional principles, not partisan interest. Would you like to respond under oath? The room erupted. Reporters scrambled from their seats, staffers whispered furiously, and the chairman's gavel thundered over the chaos. Order! Davidson shouted. The committee will come to order. But the damage was done. Dershowitz's face burned crimson as he gathered his notes, muttering under his breath. This is outrageous, he barked. A disgrace to this institution. I will not participate in this ambush. Professor, Davidson warned, you are still under oath. I'm invoking my rights as a witness. Dershowitz snapped, stuffing papers into his briefcase. This is not a hearing. It's a trap. Crockett didn't move. She sat calmly, microphone still on. The American people, she said softly, deserve constitutional consistency, not convenience. And with that, Dershowitz slammed his briefcase shut and stood. Cameras followed as he stormed out, pushing open the heavy chamber doors. The echo lingered long after he was gone. For several seconds, silence reigned. Crockett quietly stacked her papers while aides whispered around her. Chairman Davidson rubbed his temples and sighed. The witness has left the room. The committee will stand in recess for 10 minutes. As members filed out, the buzz of whispered disbelief filled the air. The confrontation had ended abruptly, but its consequences were only beginning. When the gavel struck again, order returned only in appearance. Beneath the veneer of procedure, the room still vibrated with tension. Reporters whispered into microphones. Aides darted between desks. The exit of Alan Dershowitz had already become headline material. Chairman Davidson's expression was thunderous. "Congresswoman Crockett," he began, "your ambush of this witness may have violated committee protocols. That email was not submitted in advance." Crockett leaned toward her microphone. "Mr. Chairman, all documents were obtained lawfully and are directly relevant to assessing the credibility of today's testimony. If Professor Dershowitz disputes their authenticity, he may return and clarify under oath." Shouts rose from the Republican side. "This was a political stunt," Congressman Robert Wells barked. "The only stunt here," Crockett replied calmly, "was Professor Dershowitz claiming consistency while his own record proves otherwise." Outside, chaos spilled into the hallway. Journalists crowded around the doors, phones buzzing with alerts. Within minutes, hashtags were trending nationwide. Dershowitz walkout, Crockett receipts. Inside, Davidson tried to regain control. "The committee will continue," he declared. "We have work to do." But everyone knew the story had already left the building. Meanwhile, outside the Capitol, Dershowitz strode briskly through a swarm of reporters, refusing to answer questions. His face was pale, jaw clenched. Cameras followed every step until he disappeared into a waiting car. Back in the chamber, Crockett gathered her papers with the same composure she'd shown throughout. Her staff whispered updates about social media coverage, but she stayed focused. The purpose, she reminded them, wasn't humiliation, it was accountability. Hours later, news networks played the footage on loop. Crockett unveiling the documents. The professor's startled reaction, his abrupt exit. Analysts debated whether it was a legitimate exposure or an unfair ambush. But one fact dominated the narrative. Alan Dershowitz, America's most famous constitutional scholar, had walked out of Congress rather than defend his own words. By late afternoon, the hearing had devolved into partisan recrimination. Republicans demanded investigations into how Crockett had obtained the email. Democrats praised her for courage and preparation. Each statement fed the growing media storm. At 4 p.m., Chairman Davidson called an unscheduled recess, clearly exasperated. Outside the committee room, cameras converged on Jasmine Crockett. She faced them squarely, her voice calm amid the shouting questions. "What we witnessed today," she said, "wasn't about personality. It was about the integrity of constitutional debate. When experts shift their theories based on political convenience, they erode public trust. My duty is to expose that, not to embarrass anyone, but to protect the truth." "Did you expect him to walk out?" A reporter shouted. "I expected him to defend his record," she replied. "The fact that he didn't speaks for itself." Her staff distributed copies of the timeline chart, 27 entries detailing every shift in Dershowitz's statements. The pattern was undeniable. That evening, Dershowitz appeared on a friendly news program attempting to seize back control. "What happened today was a political hit job," he said, eyes tight with anger. "Congresswoman Crockett distorted my record for partisan gain." The host nodded sympathetically, until he brought up the email. "Professor, did you or did you not offer to assist the White House in developing privileged defenses?" Dershowitz hesitated. "I was providing legal analysis, not advocacy. My communications were taken out of context." But even as he spoke, networks across the country aired split-screen coverage. Crockett presenting evidence on one side, Dershowitz on the other, visibly rattled. Public opinion was forming quickly and not in his favor. By morning, newspaper headlines blared, "Dershowitz walks out after confrontation with Crockett, email undermines." Scholars' testimony, constitutional consistency in question editorials, framed the exchange as a rare moment of accountability. Law professors across the nation weighed in, many agreeing with Crockett's central argument, that Dershowitz's interpretations shifted with the political winds. Even at Harvard, where he'd built his career, students gathered to debate his legacy. The campus paper ran an editorial questioning whether the title of emeritus professor should still carry weight without intellectual consistency. On cable news, clips of the confrontation replayed in endless cycles. The image of Dershowitz rising from his seat, papers clutched tightly, became an instant political metaphor, proof that even the most established figures could crumble when confronted with evidence. At his Cambridge home, Dershowitz held a press conference flanked by shelves of his own books. Yesterday's spectacle, he declared, was a deliberate misrepresentation of decades of scholarship. But his tone carried more defensiveness than authority. Constitutional scholars soon appeared on air to dissect the hearing. Professor Melissa Hammond summarized the consensus. When you line up his statements chronologically, the pattern is impossible to deny. The only consistent variable is the political affiliation of the president in question. By the following afternoon, Republican allies who had invited Dershowitz to testify were scrambling to distance themselves. "We appreciate his service," Chairman Davidson said cautiously, "but we disagree with how the hearing unfolded." Democrats, meanwhile, rallied behind Crockett. Speaker Melissa Jenkins called personally to commend her for re-establishing the standard of congressional oversight. On social media, the moment turned iconic. Memes showed Crockett holding her chart beside captions like "Receipts Reputation." Another image paired Dershowitz's exit with his own past quote, "When the facts are on your side, argue the facts. When the law is on your side, argue the law. When neither is on your side, storm out of Congress." Within days, the confrontation was being discussed not as an isolated clash but as a symbol, a reckoning for experts who blurred the line between principle and politics. Law schools announced panels on consistency and constitutional scholarship. News organizations reviewed their use of partisan commentators. Dershowitz's speaking engagements dwindled. Publishers reconsidered contracts. Invitations once automatic now went unanswered. The fallout was swift and surgical. Crockett, meanwhile, moved forward quietly. In interviews, she refused to gloat. "This was never personal," she told CBS News. "It's about ensuring that our legal frameworks aren't tools of convenience. Executive privilege must serve the Constitution, not the moment." 3 months later, Harvard Law School announced that Professor Alan Dershowitz had voluntarily relinquished his emeritus status to pursue independent projects. The statement was polite, but the timing spoke volumes. Journalists coined a new term, the Crockett Standard, the expectation that constitutional experts must demonstrate consistent reasoning across administrations. It became shorthand in political circles for accountability through evidence. For Jasmine Crockett, the confrontation transformed her from a rising freshman congresswoman into a national voice on constitutional integrity. Colleagues began citing her approach as a model for oversight, precise, prepared, and grounded in facts. In the months that followed, her questioning style was studied in congressional training sessions and law classrooms alike. "She didn't win because it went viral," one commentator wrote. "It went viral because she won." Even a year later, references to "Don't pull a Dershowitz" echoed through Washington, half joke, half warning. The hearing that began as routine testimony had become a cautionary tale about power, principle, and the price of inconsistency. As the Capitol lights dimmed that night, one image remained etched into the nation's memory. Jasmine Crockett sitting calm and unflinching as Alan Dershowitz, once the towering scholar of American law, gathered his papers and walked out, his footsteps marking the moment reputation met reality. And from that day forward, congressional witnesses knew the unspoken rule that lingered in every hearing room. If you face Jasmine Crockett, bring the truth or bring a good exit plan.